Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for a daily dose of Alchemy spoilers. So our new Kamigawa Neon Dynasty influence Alchemy set releasing on Thursday. Spoiler season started yesterday. We got a bunch of spicy new Magic Arena digital exclusive cards to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it and break them down. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. Number one, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout spoiler season, you can find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. Number two, if you need some paper Magic cards, you can get them from our amazing sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish and even get a free goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes and they will hook you up. Anyway, let's talk some alchemy. So first up today, we have the start of what seems to be a mythic cycle in Forceful Cultivator. So Forceful Cultivator, 4 mana 2/3, Snake Shaman, costs 2 less to cast if there are no land cards in your hand. When it enters the battlefield, search for a basic, put on the battlefield tab, and then shuffle. So this card, it's very, very interesting. I really like what the card is trying to do. You know those greedy hands that you keep, the one land, one keep style of hands? This is a card that's going to make those hands a lot better. Like if you're having some mana trouble, this card's going to be really powerful. On the other hand, if you're not having mana trouble and you have a bunch of lands in hand, it's going to get a lot worse. If you look at comparisons, at 4 mana, this is worse Ondu Giant, and Ondu Giant isn't even a very good card. On the other hand, at 2 mana, this card is kind of absurd. Like this is Rampant Growth that comes along with a 2/3 body. Sure, you got to have double green mana, but still, we don't get Rampant Growth in Alchemy or in Historic. That's not a card Wizards prints anymore. So at 2 mana, this is really, really good. So I think this card is going to be really, really interesting. Whether or not it's going to be good remains to be seen, because there's a bit of tension here. If you think about the decks that would want Forceful Cultivator, they're going to be ramp decks, most likely, where you're trying to get up to 5 mana, 6 mana, 8 mana, 10 mana, whatever. Those are the decks that are most going to be able to take advantage of this style of effect. On the other hand, ramp decks also traditionally play a lot of lands, so in your ramp deck, you might not have no lands in hand to cast this for 2 mana, and when you're casting it at 4 mana, it's probably just worse than other options available. So, as I said before, I like it for 1 land, 1 keep shenanigans. Like this is a card that lets you keep slightly greedy hands, and you can kind of build around it. Probably the easiest way to build around it is MDFC effects. Maybe you're playing a ramp deck, but you're playing a bunch of MDFCs. Forceful Cultivator is going to be great because cards like Bellowsbreath Recovery or Turn Timber Symbiosis, any of the MDFCs, they work as lands because their backside's a land, but in your hand they're going to count as spells, so they're not going to punish your Forceful Cultivator. So maybe there's some sort of weird ramp deck that's playing a ton of MDFCs and then trying to get Forceful Cultivator into Rampant Growth mode at 2 mana. So as I mentioned, I think if this card works, it's going to be in ramp decks, although there's that weird tension where ramp decks want a lot of lands, but this wants you not to have a lot of lands in hand. So maybe the MDFC plan will work. Once you get back to Historic, I think this card loses a lot of its appeal for a couple of reasons. One is it's too expensive to work with Lurrus. And Lurrus is still a dominant force in Historic. We'll see. I still think Wizards probably going to end up banning it, but for now it's legal in the format, so it doesn't work with Lurrus. Also, it's too expensive for Collected Company, which is the other kind of style of deck that might want a card like this as a creature cheap enough to hit. So it kind of is crossed off of the list of quite a few decks in the format just because it doesn't work with these cards. And then Historic also has a lot of good ramp. It's got Into the North as like a pseudo Rampant Growth if you're willing to play Snowlands. We got Gross Spirals and Solemns and Hedron Archives. So it might be that Forceful Cultivator is more of an alchemy card than a historic card. So I really like the design of this card. I like this card getting better if you don't have lands in hand, giving you more keepable hands. I think is a good thing. Less hands that do nothing is overall, I think, a positive for Magic. At the same time, I'm having a really hard time figuring out exactly how to use this card outside of the MDFC shenanigans. So we'll have to wait and see. Definitely powerful at 2 mana. At 4 mana, much less exciting. We also got the white member of this cycle in Mothrider Cavalry, a 4 mana 2/2 human samurai, which costs 2 less to cast, so 2 mana. If you have no other creature cards in your hand, or if the only other creature cards in your hand are named Mothrider Cavalry, it's a 2/2 flyer that gives all your other creatures +1/+1. So Mothrider Cavalry, kind of the same thing as the green mythic we were just talking about. 4 mana 2/2 flying that pumps your stuff. reasonable, but not super great. 2-mana 2/2 flying that does that, kind of absurd. If this compares to Benelish Marshals, Angel of Jubilations, Kangming the Sleeping Dragon, even a non-legendary version, a flying version of it. And we've seen some of these cards be playable in the past, like in a White Weenie style deck. Benelish Marshal was great when it was in Standard, Angel of Jubilation style play. So you would think that this could see play. The awkward part is, again, if you're playing White Weenie, you're probably going to have a lot of creatures, and if you're casting this for the full 4 mana, it's not super exciting. It's a worse version of Angel of Jubilation. It's a more expensive Benelish Marshal. So I really don't know how it'll shake out. I will say, I still don't understand what Wizards is trying to do with Samurais in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Samurais are all about attacking with one creature, and this is another Samurai that kind of wants you to go wide. The more creatures you have, the more power you're going to get out of that +1/+1 to all your other creature ability. Could potentially see playing just White Weenie on the top end of the curve in Alchemy, or maybe even in Historic. But again, if you're casting this for the full 4 mana, then you got Inquisitor Captains, you got the Wandering Emperor. There's a lot of really good 4-drops. So if you're casting this for full price and not getting it at that discount, I think this card's rather unexciting, which leaves one potential home for this card, which is token style decks. And I think that's where Mothrider Cavalry is probably going to shine. If you have not many actual creatures in your deck, but you have lots of token producers that make creatures, Wedding Announcements, and Azeka's Chariots, and Invoke the Ancients, and Ranger classes, then Mothrider Cavalry is going to be really, really good. It should consistently be 2 mana. Your token deck going to naturally be going wide with a bunch of tokens, and this is going to come down as a cheap 2 mana Glorious Anthem style effect, which is going to be really, really powerful. So I think that's the home for Mothrider Cavalry. Probably not going to be good enough in normal decks, but in tokens it seems great, and it might even have a shot in Historic. Once you get back to Historic, you get even more good token producers. You got Finale of Glories, and March of Multitudes, and Elspeth, and Raise the Alarm, on top of all the stuff that's legal in Standard and in Alchemy. So I think that's where Mothrider Cavalry is really going to make an impact. A really solid payoff for a token deck, where this is maybe your only creature or close to your only creature. Otherwise, if you're casting it for full price, I think your white deck probably just has better things to do for 4 mana. Speaking of spicy white cards, we got some interesting white removal in Fragment Reality. 1 mana instant, exile target non-token artifact, creature, or enchantment. Its controller puts a random creature card with lesser mana value from their library onto the battlefield tab. So Fragment Reality, it's essentially a very upgraded Divine Gambit. Remember Divine Gambit? When we all laughed at Divine Gambit and thought it was one of the worst cards ever? Fragment Reality seems like a fixed Divine Gambit, like a version that could actually be playable for a couple of reasons. One is there are ways to work around it. That's probably the biggest one. Plus, it's only 1 mana and it's an instant. Plus, if you want to go really deep, you can use this on your own cards. This just says controller. With Divine Gambit, you got to target your opponent's stuff. So you can't just desperation mode, exile one of your things in response to like a removal spell and hope to spin into something good. So this card's essentially Swords to Plowshares mixed with Disenchant, since it hits artifacts and enchantments, mixed with a weird twist on Chaos Warp, which Chaos Warp is a little weird. You never know with Chaos Warp. It could put the best card in your opponent's deck into play. It could put literally nothing into play because it only works with permanents. Fragment Reality, much more likely to put something into play. There are some workarounds for this, but it's unlikely to give your opponent their best card because it's got to get something of lesser mana value. Is this card actually good? It really depends on the matchup. There's going to be matchups where this card is going to be the best removal spell in the format. There's some decks that only have Goldspan Dragon and Leer as their creatures. Fragment Reality is kind of insane there, because remember, it only puts creatures with lesser mana value into play. So you kill a Goldspan Dragon, you kill a Leer, your opponent gets nothing. So it's just 1 mana kill your opponent's best threats. Or against a control deck where Hullbreak Horror is the only creature and they're just playing a bunch of spells and planeswalkers, this is kind of a free roll. You snipe the Hullbreak Horror for 1 mana, maybe you get a random artifact and enchantment too, no downside. Also really good against 1-drops. Against 1-drops, unless your opponent for some reason has like an Ornithopter in their deck, which isn't going to happen in Alchemy and probably not going to happen against most decks in Historic either, your opponent gets nothing. You can kill 1-drops for free because your opponent's not going to have anything to put into play. On the other hand, against just like random creature decks, this card's going to be pretty risky. Against Clerics, you kill their Inquisitor Captain and your opponent ends up with a Righteous Valkyrie or a Luminarch Aspirant. That's not very good. Or you get a Tovolar against Werewolves and your opponent gets a Werewolf Pack Leader. So in just a generic creature matchup, it's actually pretty bad removal, I think, because you're not putting your opponent down a permanent. Most of the time, you're going to get rid of something, but they're going to get something back. So sure, you can kill their best thing, but if they're getting their second best thing or their third best thing, you're not really gaining as much as if you actually killed the creature. So my guess is this is probably worse than March of Otherworldly Light. in a vacuum. Like, if I just had to choose one removal spell to put in my deck, I think I'm going to go with March of Otherworldly Light, even though it's going to be more expensive, just because I really don't want to give my opponent things. On the other hand, as we talked about before, there's some matchups where this is going to be great, so I still think there's a role for Fragment Reality, even if I don't think it's going to be just like the best white removal spell in the format. Like I said, it really depends on the meta and the matchup. If there's a lot of good matchups for this card, it certainly could be main deckable. Worst case, seems like a sideboard all-star. They can snipe all these random hate cards, can snipe creatures, lots of flexibility here. We also got the blue member of the Mythic cycle in Saiba Syphoner, and this card's pretty sweet. 4 mana 2/2, human ninja with flash. It costs 2 less to cast if there's no instants or sorceries in your hand. When it enters the battlefield, you can return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand, and if it would die, shuffle it into your library instead. So on level 1, Syphoner is a very upgraded Archaeomancer. You get extra power, you get flash, and that's kind of a big deal. There actually isn't Archaeomancer on Magic Arena. We got 5 mana versions of it, but we don't have actual Archaeomancer, and this is a much, much better version. If you want to squint, and you can get the cost reduction effect, it's actually kind of very close to a double blue Snapcaster Mage. If you think about it, Snapcaster, you cast it for 2 mana, then you can cast an instant or sorcery with flashback from your graveyard. Saiba Syphoner, if you can flash it into play for 2 mana, it's going to do the same thing. The card's going back to your hand first, but you can immediately cast it, so it's kind of historic legal, alchemy legal Snapcaster, if you can jump through that hoop, which I think the hoop of having no instant or sorceries in your hand is going to be a big one. Like, if you think about Snapcaster decks, they're full of spells. That's kind of what those decks do. So it's going to be very, very difficult for a deck that would play a Snapcaster Mage to also have no instants or sorceries in their hand, at least in the early game, which means you're probably going to be in Archaeomancer, upgraded Archaeomancer mode, much more often than Snapcaster mode. So as far as abusing this card, there's a few different possibilities. Probably the easiest way is blink effects. We've seen cards like this be really good, like in Pauper, Archaeomancers played with Ghostly Flicker. We can do similar shenanigans in Historic with Ephemerate, where you like cast your Syphoner, get a removal spell, counter spell, whatever, back to your hand, and then you Ephemerate it to get something else back to your hand, and then after Ephemerate rebounds and goes to your graveyard, you blink the Syphoner one more time, get back the Ephemerate so you can do it again, and you just have this never-ending value train of getting spells back from your graveyard. So maybe some sort of like Soul Herder deck, plus Soul Herder decks often have a lot of creatures, so you might actually get the 2 mana mode on Syphoner. On the other hand, this feels like a control card, but I'm not sure it can actually work in control decks. Think about a Teferi deck in Historic, or the Hanada deck in Alchemy and in Standard. Those decks would be great for Syphoner. You got a ton of spells for it to get back. You can get back very powerful spells. The problem is it's pretty much always going to be 4 mana. Is this good enough at 4 mana? It's close. It's, unless you have shenanigans, I'm not 100% sure. So I'm a little skeptical about just playing it in control. Maybe it's like a 1 of or a 2 of. Once you get back to Historic, it gets even a little bit worse because you got Torrential Gear Hulk, which kind of does something similar with a bigger body and it casts the instant without paying its mana cost, which is an upside. So I'm not sure if this will actually work in control decks. You might be wondering, wait a minute, why do they have this shuffle into your library instead of going to your graveyard? And my guess is there was this Blood for Bones loop deck that we played a long time ago that used similar cards to Syphoner. It didn't exist at the time, but the idea was you could Blood for Bones, sacrificing Syphoner, reanimating something, and then Blood for Bones, and Blood for Bones will let you get back the Syphoner to your hand, so then you can just loop it again and again and again. So a really cool value engine, so I think that might be why you shuffle it into your library rather than having it stay in the graveyard, although maybe it's just a ninja flavor thing. If you're looking for a janky way to build around this, I had this idea a long time ago for an Orvar twin deck where you use a card like Syphoner, although we had worse versions of it at the time, with Orvar, and then you like Defiant Strike the Syphoner and get a copy of it thanks to Orvar, and then that gets back the Defiant Strike. So then you do it again and again and again, and you just build this massive board and then beat your opponent down. It seems like that could maybe work. When I tested it before, it wasn't very good, but Syphoner does seem to improve it, so probably still an against odds deck, but a fun one to try at least. So Saiba Syphoner, I'm hyped for this card. We haven't had Archaeomancer on Arena. This is Archaeomancer plus, and if you can somehow get that cost reduction effect, it's actually pretty similar to Snapcaster, which is a really strong card. We also got Bellowsbreath Ogre, a 4 mana 3/3 Ogre Shaman, an artifact creature. It has a new ability mechanic, starting intensity of 1, and when it attacks, it deals damage equal to its intensity to any target, then perpetually increase its its intensity by 1. So essentially a 3-mana 3/3. You play it, the next turn you attack with it, you snipe something for 1. If it lives, the next turn you attack with it, and then you hit for 2, so you get a shock and then a lightning bolt. Not a bad kind of top end of an aggro deck or a mid-range style threat. Perpetually doesn't do a ton, but it does mean if your opponent kills it and you reanimate it, let's say, it's going to still keep that intensity from earlier, which is an upside. So is this card going to be playable? Maybe. If you look at Alchemy, Fable the Mirror Breaker, pretty popular in the 3-drop slot in red. Reckless Stormseeker, we got Toralf's Disciple, which didn't really catch on. Is Breathbellow Ogre going to be better than these cards? I don't know. I mean, I think it's definitely a good card. Can it beat out the competition? That's where it becomes a little questionable. I kind of wish it had haste. If you look at these other cards, Stormseeker can give itself haste, Disciple has haste, Fable or Mirror Breaker doesn't actually have haste, but it makes up for that with a bunch of additional value from being a saga. So if Deathbellow Ogre had haste, I think this card would be really, really good, and I'd be very high on it. Without haste, we'll have to wait and see. Once you get back to Historic, I think it's a little bit harder. You got Annex and Bone Crusher and Seasoned Pyromancer on top of all the standard legal stuff. So Bellowsbreath Ogre, cool mechanic, I guess, with the intensity building up and dealing more and more damage. Close enough to being playable that you could definitely throw this in a mono red deck, let's say, or some sort of Gruul mid-range deck, and it's going to be fine. Is it the most optimal best option? I guess we'll have to test and see. My guess is maybe not, but who knows? We haven't got to play with intensity before, so maybe it's even more powerful than it looks. And if you can give this haste, then it becomes really good, because I love that you can attack with this and then snipe down blockers to get them out of the way, and then it gets more intense. The next time you get even more damage to snipe down bigger blockers, and you can kind of snowball it and then eventually throw the damage at your opponent's face to close out the game. So it is a good card. Is it better than all the other options? The only time will tell. We also got Boseiju's Pathlighter, a 3-mana 3/2 human rogue that when it enters a battlefield, you draft a card from its spellbook. So what is Boseiju Pathlighter's spellbook? It is a huge array of non-basic lands, basically all colorless or green lands. I mean, some of them are pretty powerful depending on the situation. There's creature lands and card draw lands and treasure lands and removal lands like Boseiju. So you have a nice suite of lands to potentially get. So if you think about what this is, I mean, it's kind of a upgraded district guide, a far finder, a rogue refiner that always draws a land and doesn't care about energy. Is that a playable card? I don't know. District Guide Farfinder haven't really seen much play. Rogue Refiner was very good in its era, but it also cared about energy. It wasn't played too much outside of energy decks or decks that could take advantage of energy. It's nice that you can get non-basic lands. Like, this is a pretty powerful list of lands that you can get, so that is an upside compared to like a District Guide. Also get a better body. So I think this is a better version of that effect, but stuff like District Guide is pretty far away from being playable, so I think that Boseiju's Pathlighter, it's probably a fine card. I mean, a 3-drop that draws a card with its ETB, even if it's a land, that's still a pretty reasonable card, but I don't think it does anything particularly groundbreaking or crazy. So it's definitely something you can play just for value in your mid-range deck or ramp deck, but I don't think you got to do anything specific to build around it or anything like that. We also got a wild one in Kami of Transmutation, a 2-mana 2/2 spirit that when it enters or leaves the battlefield, you choose to either make each permanent in your hand an artifact perpetually, in addition to its other types, or the same thing for enchantment. So when it comes into play, every permanent in your hand is going to become either an artifact or enchantment, and then you get to choose again when it leaves play. So what do you do with the Kami of Transmutation? This is such a weird card. In level 1, good in affinity decks, good in enchantment decks, like a Constellation, a Citizen Champion. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield, you draw a card and put a counter on it, you play Kami, and then this is going to turn all your lands in every other permanent in your hand into an enchantment, so they're all going to trigger your Citizen Champion. Or maybe you're playing Michiko's Reign of Truth, which just cares about artifacts or enchantments on the battlefield. Turn all of your lands and other permanents into those types, so you're going to get more power out of its pump, or Scambling Shoot to grow its power. So those are kind of the most basic, easiest ways to take advantage of it. The only downside is Kami isn't a enchantment or an artifact itself, and it's a little bit awkward to play too many non-enchantment cards in your Enchantress deck or too many non-artifact cards in your Affinity style deck. Although it is nice that your first Kami can potentially turn the next copy that's in your hand into those types, so it gets better as the game goes along. But worth keeping in mind, you don't want to just overload on Citizen Champions and Kamis, because then if you don't draw the right cards in the right order, you're not going to be able to execute your game plan. There's also some kind of shenanigans with this card. One that Phil at Brewer's Kitchen sent me that was kind of a neat idea. I think more of an against odds idea than top tier competitive idea, but use Kami to turn sagas into artifacts, and then you can use Soul Diviner to remove the counters from them and keep resetting them. So like Elspeth Conquers Death, its first lore counter is going to be exiling something of your opponents, or Kiora Bestasiga, the first lore counter is going to be making these huge Krakens. If you can keep resetting it and getting back to that first lore counter, you're going to be able to keep reusing that ability again and again and again. So that's kind of a neat, janky way to take advantage of it. There's also infinite combos for this card. The most straightforward, turn Archon of Falling Stars into an enchantment. Archon of Falling Stars, when it dies, you can return an enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield. So then you have an Archon that essentially can reanimate itself when it dies. So you sack it to a Boseiju, it can reanimate itself again and again and again. Throw a Blood Artist into the mix, you just win the game on the spot. Can also like turn non-artifacts into artifacts, so you could reanimate them with Trash for Treasure, Refurbish. So there's all kinds of sweet little synergies with this card. Also in Historic, like turning all your lands into artifacts for Affinity seems really good, although as I said before, I'm still a little scared. Do I want my Historic Affinity deck, a pretty good archetype in Historic, do I want that to be playing this non-artifact card for the upside of turning my lands into artifacts to power up my other stuff? I'm not 100% sure. I'm always skeptical of non-artifact cards in Affinity or non-enchantment cards in Enchantress. The other thing to point out about this card is it's not risk-free. Turning all of your permanents into artifacts or enchantments means that like all of a sudden Farewell turns into an Armageddon and can blow up your lands, or Cleansing Nova can blow up your lands and all your other permanents. Prismari Command, its artifact destruction mode, can suddenly snipe whatever you turn into an artifact that it wouldn't be able to hit otherwise. So there is some risk here. Like artifacts and enchantments are fragile card types. There's additional hate for them. So keep that in mind. You gotta be doing something relatively powerful with this to make it worth it, but in the right deck, in those Enchantress decks, in those Affinity decks, in those combo decks, Kamigawa Transmutation, really spicy card, and we're just scratching the surface. This card was just spoiled. If you got more ideas of what to do with this card, let me know in the comments, because this card has me really intrigued, and there's probably even better combos that I haven't thought of yet. We also got Junkyard Scrapper, which is just some nice card draw for an artifact deck. 3-mana 3/3 Goblin Artificer. Whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield under your control, exile a random non-land artifact with lesser mana value from your library. You may cast that card until the end of your next turn. So essentially, you play some artifacts, then you get more artifacts, which then you can play, which then you will trigger your Junkyard Scrapper to get some more artifacts to play the next turn. So a nice card advantage engine in an artifact deck. I'm not sure if there's any way to set up a combo with this. With the lesser mana value restriction, like if you only played one 4-mana artifact and one 3-mana artifact and one 2-mana artifact, you could kind of control it, but then you cast your 4-mana artifact, you might get the 2-mana artifact. So I don't know if there's any way to really combo with this, but in a deck with just a bunch of artifacts, I feel like this could just be a nice card advantage engine that can at least be a good sideboard card for control matchups where you're going to need to fight through your opponent's disruption, and might even be good enough in the main deck as well. I mean, it is a 3/3 for 3, which isn't bad stats, and the amount of card advantage it can generate when things go right in the correct deck is really immense. We also got a pretty interesting blue sorcery in Better Offer. So Better Offer, blue and X sorcery. Put a random creature card with mana value X or less from target opponent's library onto the battlefield under your control. It perpetually has base power and toughness of XX and perpetually gains ward 1. So essentially Better Offer, 2 mana, you're going to get a 1-mana creature from your opponent's deck, and it's going to be a 1/1. 3 mana, you could get a 1 or a 2-mana creature, but it's going to be a 2/2 because of its base power and toughness setting. If you cast it for 9 mana, you could get any creature in your opponent's deck, presumably, but it's going to be an 8/8. So even if you do hit your opponent's 1-drop, it's still going to be pretty big. So if you think about this card, it's kind of like a bad Bribery. Bribery is powerful because it gives you control over it. You get to choose your opponent's best creature. This is going to give you a random one, even though the fact that the creature is going to scale no matter what is nice. Another comparison is like reverse Green Sun Zenith, but again, you're getting a random creature rather than the best creature for a situation. So it's better off or actually good? I'm leaning towards no. If you think about how this scales, it kind of scales like a Wildwood Scourge or a Roki Jelly or Contortionist Troop. 1+X to cast a creature traditionally isn't super playable. We'll see, maybe being in blue makes it different. These cards are most often green, so maybe this is just a finisher for a blue deck, a sideboard card for a blue deck. In some matchups, you can kind of control it. Like if your opponent has very few creatures, you're going to be able to snag a specific one. Like if your opponent only has Hullbreaker Horror and you get to 8 mana, you know that's what you're going to get. On the other hand, there is some risk here. If you cast this for 2 mana and your opponent doesn't have any 1-drops, it kind of just does nothing because there's no creature to actually snag with it. So if you think about the matchups, you do have some control over this. Like you're up against the enchantment deck, you cast it for 2 mana, you're getting a Generous Visitor, or against Mono White, you're getting probably Hopeful Initiate or Usher of the Fallen. Against the Orzhov decks, Eye Twitcher, Shambling Gas, is that going to be worth it? I really don't know. I think this is a card that is more a fun card than a good card, and I'm excited for it because I really just love playing Thief decks, and we keep getting more and more of these cards that steal your opponent's cards. So I'm excited to play this with like Clonecrafter and Siphon Insight, maybe Rahilda, just all this steal your opponent's cards, jam them all together in a deck. Usually the deck isn't very good, but it is really fun. So I think better offering probably more of a meme card than actually a competitive card, but it is a really neat design, and in the right matchup, it can be pretty powerful. We also got a spicy Black Spirit in Kami of Mourning. So 3 mana, 3/2, and it says whenever it enters a battlefield, target creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard perpetually gains. When a creature you control with greater mana value than this creature dies, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield tab. So you play this, you choose a creature on the battlefield or the graveyard, and then whenever something bigger dies, you're going to get that card back into play. This card is pretty sweet. It has combo potential and it just has value potential. Like you could throw this into a random sacrifice deck and probably get value out of it. You target your Kroxa, and then whenever a Mayhem Devil or a Woe Strider dies, you're going to get back the Kroxa and get its trigger and make your opponent discard and maybe make them lose life. Or maybe you can do some loops with Cauldron Familiar. Like imagine if you play a Stone Coil Serpent in your Cauldron Familiar deck, you can target the Stone Coil with a Kami of Mourning. Every time you sack the Cauldron Familiar, you're going to be able to get back the Stone Coil Serpent. Sure, it's going to be a 0/0 and die, but that's going to trigger your Blood Artist effects, any of those death trigger synergies. So that's another possible use. Also just seems good with Eye Twitches and Shambling Gas, just getting them back throughout the game, sacrificing them for value. Even if you don't really build around it, like you're just going to have random creatures that are going to die throughout the game, and you're going to get this extra value by getting more lessons, getting more treasures out of your Shambling Gas. There's also some really weird synergistic possibilities, like Resembling Skeleton with Oglor and Elcid of Life's Bounty, just trying to keep getting things back from the graveyard, getting back Stitcher Supplier for more Mill Elcid to maybe be able to protect your Oglor, and then Oglor is going to be generating zombies as you go through this loop. Would a deck like this actually be competitive? Probably not, but it does seem fun, like this weird graveyardy digital only aristocrat style shell. There's also some combo potential. It takes a lot of pieces to actually go infinite with this card, but let's say in Historic, you can Kami of Mourning on a Vesper Lark, let's say. Vesper Lark, when it leaves the battlefield, you can reanimate a creature with power 1 or less, and then you have Sling Gang Lieutenant. Sling Gang Lieutenant, a 1/1, comes into play, make some goblins, and then you can sack a goblin to drain for 1, throw a free sack outlet like Woe Strider into the mix, and you just go infinite. So you're able to like Vesper Lark your Sling Gang into play, sack all your goblins, and the Sling Gang itself, when Sling Gang dies, it's going to get back the Vesper Lark thanks to Kami of Mourning. Then you sack the Vesper Lark to get back the Sling Gang Lieutenant, and then you sack all your stuff again, just keep going through that loop. So again, this is like a 4-ish piece combo. You need Kami, you need Vesper Lark, you need a Sling Gang, you need a free sacrifice outlet. 4 pieces probably means it's more more like a for fun thing than a really competitive thing. Can also do it in even a jankier way with like Archon of Falling Stars and Colossal Sky Turtle, where you just keep looping those two, where Archon gets back the turtle, and the turtle, if you sacrifice it, gets back the Archon, and then throw a Blood Artist or something into the mix, and you're able to just drain your opponent out of the game. So it is a really interesting design. So Kami and Mourning, out of all the cards we've talked about so far, this is definitely the most intriguing. So far, all the combos I found for it are like 3 or 4 pieces, which probably means they're not super competitive, but it does seem really cool, and it opens up these really neat loops that we just really haven't seen before, because we've never had a card like this before. So even if those decks aren't really good, they seem really fun to brew around and just see if we can make them go off. We also got a new equipment insect, Foundry Beetle, a 2-mana 2/2 with first strike that can reconfigure for 1. It gives the equipped creature first strike, and at the beginning of your upkeep, a random artifact card in your hand perpetually gains. This spell costs 1 less to cast. So Foundry Beetle, I think this card's pretty bad. So my first instinct is probably one of the weaker cards we've talked about from this Alchemy release so far. It just looks so underpowered compared to Fearsome Whelp. If it does have a chance, it's probably going to be in some sort of dedicated equipment deck. Like if you have cards that just care about equipment, Arm Scavenger, Nahiris, if you're playing this equipment tribal theme, then I could see this being in the conversation. Like it is an equipment, so it's going to trigger various effects, and then it's going to reduce the cost of your equipment, which is kind of a nice little bonus. So maybe in a dedicated equipment deck, but otherwise, it feels just a little bit slow, a little bit underpowered compared to other cards that do similar things in Alchemy. We also got a few lower rarity cards. I know, tons of rares and mythics, but there are some uncommons in this Alchemy release, including Dragonfly Pilot, a 1-mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you conjure up a card named Dragonfly Suit, a vehicle that's a 3-mana 3/2 with flying and crew 1, and then it crews vehicles as though its power was 2 or greater. So Dragonfly Pilot, I actually think people are sleeping on this card a little bit. It reminds me a little bit of a really bad Thraben Inspector. Thraben Inspector, just a 1-drop that eventually is going to draw you a card. Has proven itself to be very playable all the way back to Modern. I think that Dragonfly Pilot is its own weird vehicle-y version of this. Like, sure, the card you're drawing with Dragonfly Pilot is always going to be Dragonfly Suit, which, I don't know if that's a super powerful card. A pretty medium vehicle. Not horrible, but medium. So that's the drawback. Thraben Inspector gives you a random card. The upside is you just get the card right away. You don't get to spend mana to crack the clue or anything like that. If you think about Thraben Inspector, you're technically spending 3 mana to draw a single card, and you get the body left behind. So I think just the fact that this is a 1-drop that generates card advantage, even if the card advantage it's generating isn't the most powerful card advantage, is pretty reasonable. Plus, in a vehicle deck, a 1-drop that crews for 3, similar to Hotshot mechanic, can be pretty powerful. That crews a Mobilizer mech or a Reckoner Bankbuster. If you go back to Historic, it crews Heart of Kieran, Sky Sovereign, and maybe you just jam them together, throw in a Giant Ox, and just build full-on vehicle tribal in Historic or something. With Dragonfly Pilot is a pretty key 1-drop to the deck. So I don't think Dragonfly Pilot is busted, but I do think as a 1-drop that draws a card and has some upside with vehicles, it definitely could be played in a vehicle deck. We also got Kami of Bamboo Groves, which kind of an interesting twist on Arboreal Grazer. So Arboreal Grazer, you remember this one, kind of had a love-hate relationship with this card. It was really good in Standard at one point in certain decks. Kami, when it comes into play, is a 1-mana 1/1. You put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, and then you can channel it for 3 mana, discard it, and conjure 2 forests into your hand. So is this better than Arboreal Grazer? And I think that's really up for debate. On one hand, Kami has the upside of being able to be discarded to get 2 forests, which is something you would want in a ramp deck. One of the biggest problems with Arboreal Grazer is it's really bad off the top in the mid game once you don't have extra lands in hand. On the other hand, one of the upsides of Grazer is a 0/3 is actually a surprisingly effective blocker against aggro. Kami's not going to do that. It's a 1-mana 1/1, so it's not really going to block much at all. I guess it could chump block for a turn maybe, but it's not going to just stonewall Grizzly Bear style effects like Arboreal Grazer does. So is this card going to see play? Maybe. I think if it does see play, it's going to be in a ramp deck. It's also worth pointing out that Arboreal Grazer isn't really a good card in a vacuum. Like, if you just jam it in a typical deck, you're not always going to have the lands you need. And I think the same is true of Kami, even though the channel upside does help there. But Arboreal Grazer was good because of the other cards around it in Standard. We had Growth Spirals and Uros, so you could get away with playing like 30 lands and just never running out of action. And then Arboreal Grazer was kind of free upside. Plus, we had the Mulligan rule change, so if it was bad, you could put it to the bottom on the mulligan. So Kami, I think, could do something similar to Arboreal Grazer. It's also worth pointing out that Grazer doesn't really see play anymore in Historic, so Kami's going to have to break the mold and not only be better than Grazer, but enough better to make decks want to play this card. The other possibility is maybe you just take advantage of the fact it's an enchantment creature. Like, you could play in a rune deck just as a 1-mana enchantment. I don't really know what it specifically does there. I guess if you have enough lands in hand, it can ramp you into your Runeforged Champion a turn earlier. Like, having extra mana is never a bad thing. So maybe one of the rune decks or enchantment decks could play it just based on its enchantment creature type. But Kami, it's interesting. We'll have to wait and see. I really don't know what to make of this card. I'm probably the worst person to evaluate Arboreal Grazer, because when everyone else loved it and was playing it, I still hated it, and this card just looks like another Grazer to me. So we'll have to wait and see, but worth keeping in mind for ramp decks at a minimum. Anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our daily Alchemy spoilers for today. So what do you think? Which of these cards are you most hyped for? Are you hyped about any of them? What are you going to play in Alchemy? What are you going to play in Historic? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back tomorrow with more daily Alchemy spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon.